Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever it is you may be calling in from. I'm Lucy Bernholtz. I'm the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University's Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and along with my colleagues from the Department of Communication and the McCoy Family Center on Ethics and Society, it's a delight to welcome you here for this conversation with Kate Crawford and Fred Turner. I'd like to first acknowledge that Stanford University was founded on the ancestral territory of the Muwekma Ohlone people, one of many communities in what we now call the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, we are connected via a vast array of servers and computers situated on stolen land. We acknowledge the dispossession of indigenous land by the data-driven logic of white settler expansion and uplift the sovereignty of indigenous people in data. We commit to dismantling the modern-day colonialism and its material implications on our digital worlds. I borrowed that land acknowledgement from colleagues at Data and Society, and it seems particularly apropos for this exciting conversation. It's my job here and my pleasure to introduce Kate and Fred and let you all know that you can join in the conversation by entering your questions into the Q&A. They will be fed over to Fred Turner, and he and Kate will discuss them after about 20 minutes of conversation between the two of them. So a very brief introduction of these two illustrious individuals. Kate Crawford is a writer, composer, producer, and academic. She's currently a professor at USC Annenberg, a senior researcher at Microsoft Research, and a visiting chair of AI and Justice at ENS in Paris. She's also the author of the new book, Atlas of AI, which we'll be discussing in a few minutes. Fred Turner is the Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University and the author of the forthcoming book, Seeing Silicon Valley, which is done in collaboration with photographer Mary Beth Meehan. With no further ado and no additional introduction, I give you Fred Turner and Kate Crawford.
Hi there. Kate, are you out there?
I'm out here, Fred. It's so lovely to see you.
Likewise. It feels completely strange, of course, to be having our conversation in front of these little black squares that have people's names on them. But I trust that there are people behind them, and it's nice to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk with you about this book. There's an awful lot to admire here, both the scholarship and the way that you've written it. And I want to ask about both. So, in your introduction, you actually lay out 4 questions, and I think they're terrific, and they might make a nice guide for us in the conversation. And they run like this. What is AI? What forms of politics does it propagate? Whose interests does it serve? And who bears the greatest risk of harm? So let's just start with that first question. What is AI? And let me say, going in, that I have friends who've told me, look, Fred, AI, it's just a tool, isn't it?
Well, that's a really common definition of artificial intelligence. I mean, if you ask somebody in the street, what is AI? They might tell you that it's Apple's Siri or Amazon's Alexa, or they might think of Google's search algorithm, or they might think of Tesla's semi-autonomous cars. If we look at textbooks, you'll also see really technical, quite narrow definitions. I'm thinking here of things like Stewart and Russell's classic textbook on AI, which defines AI as intelligent agents that sort of take the best possible action in any situation. And I think every one of these definitions is doing a sort of work. It's sort of giving us a frame for thinking about what AI is, how it should be understood, and how it should be governed. And what I really tried to do in this book, Atlas of AI, is really open up the lens much more widely to say, how is AI made in this broadest sense? Where does it come from? Where are the sorts of components mined and smelted? What are those elements of minerals and energy that actually drive it? And then what about the human labor behind it? All of the people who actually make it work, from labeling data to sort of producing the components to working in the warehouses. And then finally, where does all this data come from? This sort of vast harvesting of data that happens across the internet and beyond, that is core to how machine learning works today. So in that sense, I'm really trying to find a much more sort of materialist analysis of artificial intelligence to ground it in how it's actually produced. And I guess in some ways to really posit the question, AI is actually, is it either artificial or intelligent? And I would suggest no, it's very material, and it's not intelligent in the way that we think of human intelligence.
Right. It's interesting that you call this book the Atlas of AI, and you've taken an atlas-like approach in your exploration of AI. Can you say a little bit about how you did that, why you did that, and how you structured it as you moved through the book?
Absolutely. Well, I think of atlases as really unusual books. Atlases are books that you can pick up and see something from the perspective of an entire country or a continent, or you can zoom in and you can see a mountain range or a city. And in that sense, they're kind of books for exploration and for really looking at scale in different ways, trying to see systems at different levels of scale. And, I kind of think of the people who have written beautifully about atlases, people like Ursula Franklin, the physicist and technology critic. And she sort of writes about how atlases allow you to bridge the sort of the known and the unknown, to sort of find these sorts of collective documents of understanding. And certainly like any book, this is very much, a collective document. It points to so much of the work that's looking at how we should be reframing artificial intelligence and thinking at these different levels of scale. But there's another way that I think atlases are useful here. And it's the way in which often atlases are maps of domination. They show us the path lines of empire. They show us how power has been constructed, and then the shifts between centers and peripheries over centuries. And I see this in AI too. I mean, we have, the great houses of AI, we're really talking about less than a dozen companies who really constitute this industry at scale, and to try and understand the way in which that creates also maps of domination and control. So in that way, the title is sort of looking at AI itself as a form of trying to make a centralized atlas. So I guess I'm working against that to try and say we need different ways of seeing and thinking about AI.
No, I love that. And the kind of critique of colonialism runs all through the book. It sort of marbles the book. And as you're wrestling with AI in a contemporary setting, you're also always pointing back to Frederick Taylor and Taylorism, to earlier extractive moments. And I did sometimes wonder, as I was reading the book, where you see AI as a process, as a set of technologies, in relation to these earlier projects, large-scale industrial extraction, mining, Taylorism and the Taylorist control of the workforce, the micromanagement of time, all these things that we know from the industrial era. Where is AI in relation to those? Isn't it something new?
I see it as profoundly embedded in those histories, that really AI as we understand it now comes out directly from those industrial pathways of production. One of the things I did for the book is to really travel to various sites where AI is made, sort of going to the mines where, elements like lithium crystal are being pulled out of the earth and looking at those economies, but also going to the places where people are sort of working to sort of fill in the gaps that AI and robotics cannot. And obviously it's sort of exemplar of that sort of workplace is the Amazon Fulfillment Center. And it was interesting in spending time in these spaces. I went to one that's in Robbinsville in New Jersey, which is a highly automated space. You've got Kiva robots kind of gliding around. Is the degree to which it really does look a lot like those early representations of Ford factories, that sort of microtonized levels of human work, and then with a touch of that kind of Taylorist idea of micromanagement of human bodies. So I do see these spaces very much as building on as extensions of those in many cases dehumanizing factory histories. But there are new things, and you're right, Fred, that to really look at what is different here. And here I sort of, I'd point to a couple of things. And I like the way Mackenzie Walk writes about this, that we might think about AI as being just like another version of how late capitalism works. But, Mackenzie actually says this could actually be something a little different. This is forming almost a type of info-feudalism where you have very few people at the very top making an enormous amount of money with enormous amounts of control of these systems. And everybody else is giving their data over to be harvested in this way. And I also think of, Jathan Sadowski has this fantastic essay around when data became capital. So if we start to see data as a form of capital that can be extracted at every juncture and therefore should be extracted, you produce this vision of the world whereby constant harvesting is not only justified, but is moralized. It's like you should capture all of the data all of the time. So, I see those histories very much as forming the substrates of artificial intelligence, but that we're seeing new facets, this intensification, if you will, of some of those underlying dynamics, specifically in these planetary systems?
It's so interesting. I want to press on this idea of extraction industry because it's an idea I've used myself. I think about it a lot, and I've been struck by having spent a lot of time at sort of looking at the expressive cultures of America and other countries and how those feed into large-scale data systems. And what I'm intrigued by here is whether or not extraction as we understand it in a kind of surveillance capitalism setting really is the same thing as a kind of extraction industry from the past. And let me just lay it out a little bit. I think about how when we mine coal, when we dig up coal, it's gone. Coal's gone. We ruin the earth. We spew pollution. When my data is mined, or when I offer my data through my expressiveness to Facebook or other large-scale systems doing machine learning on the data I present, or when I present my face to the public for scanning, I'm still here. My data image travels away from me. My data exhaust is released and my automobile drives on. Isn't that different at some kind of core level than the mining of coal or the smelting of ore?
They are different, but they're deeply connected, is what I would say. So one of the things that I think has been a bit of a trap are the metaphors that we use for thinking about data, right? So, Luke Stark and Anna Lauren Hoffman have this great piece on, this idea of data as the new oil and how much that has done a disservice to thinking about the way that data works. I'm also not a huge fan of the term data exhaust, because while it does invoke ideas of pollution, it gives you the sense, it's gone. It has no more impact on me. It's over there. Goodbye. I still have, the things that are fundamentally my own. What we're seeing is that all of those forms of interaction, communication, which get labeled under this bloodless term data, can have profound impacts on you. They do stay connected to you. They can become part of, the way in which you are credit scored across multiple systems. It can have direct impacts on your opportunities, the way that you might be assessed for a job or for a promotion. And of course, in the carceral state, we see how data is used to create great harm in terms of the way that people are understood as objects that might reoffend according to a score, or the ways in which some neighborhoods are subject to forms of predictive policing more than others. So there are racialized logics and gender logics and class logics built into the way that data is seen and understood. But I think we erase those with these kind of easy metaphors. So for me, it's about trying to trace where those logics of extraction came from, particularly those early mining logics, and how they've been imported, much to our detriment, into how these systems really use data and use these reflections on us and on everyday life.
You use a wonderful phrase in the book, epistemological violence. It's a lot of syllables, but it's a really nice way of capturing, I think, what happens when data and knowledge meet machine systems that have particular demands upon machine systems. Can you just walk us through a little bit how the social world becomes datafied, and as it does, the sort of epistemological violence that occurs with, what are those consequences once that's happened?
Well, this obviously is a term that is in long use. It's certainly not something that I invented, and post-colonial scholars have used it for decades in terms of the way in which we understand and make knowledge from the world can also do violence to communities and to groups for decades. So looking into how knowledge is made, I think, is an important way to look at those sorts of distinctions. The person who I think is so fascinating here is Simone Brown, who writes about this idea of digital epidermalization, or the way that because of skin tone or appearance, people are put into categories of race, for example. Now, this is something that machine learning systems do all the time. Again, if you think about the way that facial recognition systems work, they're often subtended to, your skin tone is this, therefore you are this race. Or you appear, you have long hair, you are therefore female, and we have gender binary sort of baked into these systems. These are forms of really kind of making race and gender through the design of technical systems without the consent, or even in many cases, even the awareness of the people who are being judged and put into these kinds of categories. So that work of making people, which is, something that Ian Hacking has written about for many years, that work creates feedback loops. It doesn't just sort of put somebody in a box for a technical system, but it then makes people actually have to respond to the way that they're represented by technical systems.
Right.
There's a great example here. You probably remember this one, Fred. Back in the early days of Facebook, there were sort of gender binaries. You know, you'd have sort of man, woman, other, you know, these sorts of terrible other categories. And after, you know, many complaints and changes, you know, these categories were expanded. You know, they went to 56 categories. They sort of continued to expand. And that could be seen as a story of progress, right? That we sort of, we start to have more categories that we can put ourselves in. But that work of classification itself continues. And you think about the choice of doing that versus saying having an open text field or not talking about how we gender ourselves at all. These are all decisions that are made in the design of a system that have these very long tails of impact in terms of how people understand each other, themselves, and the worlds in which they operate. So thinking about forms of those kinds of violence in knowledge making and in classification making is a big theme in this book. And I think it helps us, I think, get beyond some of the less helpful debates, which have tended to focus on narrow terms like bias, which I think, you know, confuses many of us because it means one thing in statistics. It means something very different in sociology. It means something different again in the sort of juridical disciplines. So it has a tendency to make us think that these are issues which can be coded away, which we can have technical fixes for, rather than looking at these deeper logics. And that's something that I try to address in this book.
Yeah, I love the way that you work with classification, and I'm thinking here of Bowker and Starr and their book on classification, how powerful that was. One of the things that I think you flag in the book that even goes farther is you flag the way that classification systems become material systems in our machinery and in our social processes and live lives inside institutions that have their own power. So we think about Facebook. Facebook is making choices about how to use those classification systems. Later on, you talk about Palantir and its ties to the state. The really important stuff. What role do you see for institutions in the modeling of AI as you've been thinking about it?
Well, so often sort of the institutional view drops away. And I think that's why, you know, these questions of how we define AI are so important. Because if we think about them in these sort of abstract algorithmic nowheres, you're not looking at the sort of specific situated somewheres of these are rooms full of people making decisions within institutions that you know are driven by a set of priorities, and that's something as a field in AI it's just desperately needed. And I'm so glad that you mentioned, you know, Bowker and Starr, who've been enormous influences on my thinking, and I think those, you know, the work of things like of looking at classificatory systems, also Lorraine Daston's work here is so important. It shifts our focus into saying who made this system and who did they have in mind? Who was the imaginary user of this system? And then how does that sort of imaginary, if you will, shape who is served and who is not served? And we're seeing so many, I think, really fantastic studies that open that up. I'm also thinking of one of your colleagues, Angèle Christine, who's done really fantastic work looking at this in terms of going into the sites and the places and the institutions where these decisions are being made. And that's how we see these sort of loose joins between what a technical system promises to do, which is, you know, serve everyone, whereas the reality, which is that it really is serving a very specific type of population.
Right. Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I'm going back now to think of those four questions that you know we sort of opened our conversation with, and they're all analytical questions. They're all, what is AI? What politics does it propagate? Whose interest does it serve? Who bears the risk of greatest harm? All really important. And when I wrestled with those questions and I came toward the end of the book, I did find myself thinking again about where institutions meet devices and where devices meet our lives. And I don't have a way to yet, and I'm hoping you're going to give me one. I don't really have a way yet to think about where we might intervene. And let me ask that in a very specific sense. What might states do? Or should they do? What should corporations that deploy AI do? And what should those of us who teach, study, work, design, and build inside institutions like Stanford be doing?
Well, that's the big question, Fred. So let's solve that in 2 minutes, shall we? Look, you know, let me answer it this way. I want to be really clear. this book and in my work generally, I am not suggesting that this is a consumer choice problem, that we should be choosing sort of that there is a brand of ethical AI that we can sort of buy off the shelves, or that, there's a better phone or a different laptop or, a different hosting service. That thinking, I think, has been part of the problem of the way that we've addressed these issues. That, either we have sort of engineers and computer scientists who can technically fix a system, and then anything else down the pipeline is up to consumers to sort of protect their privacy or understand the framework or use different systems. It's simply not possible, and these are clearly structural problems that require collective forms of action. So certainly one of the things you can say about the tech sector is that it has been remarkably unfettered by regulation for the last 15 years, and that has produced, I think, an ideology of, well, move fast and break things, create a system, test it out on a live population. If it doesn't work, deprecate it, do something different. It doesn't matter too much. We'll just keep improving a system. And now we're starting to see that attitude, I think, brought into even the work of regulation itself. I mean, in Australia recently, you might have seen the moment where Facebook, in a negotiation with the Australian government around regulation, decided to switch off newsfeed completely to the country, and to also prevent Australian media producers from sharing their work with the world. I think that showed us something very important. It showed us that there is a trap in looking at these systems as civic infrastructure, as something that we genuinely do have as a sort of public set of tools that we share, that it really is for us to sort of contact friends and family, for the soccer group to kind of share their information about where they're going to be meeting next week, for student political groups to organize. But in actual fact, these are private infrastructures that are now being used and deployed in very specific geopolitical battles over how they will be regulated in the next decade. And that is really where I think we need to pay a lot more attention. The other thing that I say in the book, and this is, to bring us, I think, to an optimistic point, Fred, because there's a lot here to be concerned about, I grant you. But the thing that I have learned so much from is really looking at the many groups that have been addressing these issues for decades, whether it be climate justice, whether it be labor rights, whether it be data protection. And I think in some ways that's where change is going to come from, is seeing these groups actually, and in many ways for us to join into those collective actions, and to see these fights over how technical systems are part of our lives as a much broader question around how do we want to live, rather than how do we create sort of the perfect AI.
Yeah, thank you. That's just terrific, and I think that's a wonderful place to turn the conversation over to our audience. So if we were live and in person, I'd be applauding. I'll make my hand gesture. It is what it is in cyberspace. But we have some questions piling up, and so I want to get to them before we end. I want to turn first to Dan Kotliar, a postdoc here. And Dan says, I'm going to be reading the questions. So folks who are asking questions, please post them online, and they'll be sorted and sent to me. I wanted to ask about the hype. I'm just reading in Dan's voice now. I wanted to ask about the hype around AI in academia. I guess that the upsides of this hype are quite clear. We get a lot of great research about it, but what are its downsides? For example, some of the issues in your book are in fact so much wider than AI, e.g. the crucial environmental questions you raised. Do you feel that the focus on AI may make us overlook, oops, sorry, my screen is moving, may make us overlook other more fundamental questions, or make other non-AI tech understudied?
Yes, is my short answer to that. Look, as someone who's been focusing on large-scale data systems, machine learning, and AI, like for the last almost 15 years, it's gone from really being very few people who are looking at these issues from an anthropological, sociological, or STS perspective, to it now being many, many people and many overlapping communities. And I actually think that's fantastic. There's so much to look at, primarily because these systems have moved simultaneously into so many institutions and industries just in the last 10 years. I mean, it is all of the things that we talk about, healthcare, education, criminal justice, hiring, so many systems that we see as core parts of the social fabric are now in relation to these systems working at multiple levels. So we need more research urgently. And particularly that's because if you look at AI institutes over the last 20 years, they're almost all technical institutes. They focus on code and algorithms. They try primarily hire and produce people who focus in computer sciences and engineering. And while that is important, it doesn't tell you these bigger effects that these systems can have. It doesn't teach you how to study whether a system is going to produce differential impacts across different groups. Yeah. So bringing that awareness in is actually incredibly important. But it does something else too, and you're exactly right with this question, that, does it produce an overemphasis on the technical piece when precisely what we're trying to do is decenter that? And I would agree. Like, how do we decenter the technical part to look at this much wider chain of from supply chains to logistics to how we have things like overnight shipping bring us things to our door? Because AI is just one part of that picture. So what I'm really trying to do with this book is to open that up much more widely so that we can look at that sort of nose to tail making of AI. And in many ways, that means decentering the tech component itself.
Love it. You use a phrase in the book, actually, you and Alice Campolo used the phrase enchanted determinism, which I rather like. And it sort of conveys this notion that there's this magic in the machinery somewhere. It's just poof, it's like Glinda. It descends down from the heavens and, Oz is green again. And, it just doesn't work that way. And your book shows that very clearly. Garrett Chan has a question. He says, in contrast to Western colonialism, some might argue China is taking a different approach. Vassalization and farming of data AI systems to the goals of the central authority instead of extracting from landscape. Do you think China is different from Western colonialism?
That is a very multifaceted question, and one that I think that the obvious answer has to be yes. There are very important differences historically, culturally, socially. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the way that AI is made, these kinds of material practices of making that, go from mining to labor to data extraction, there's extraordinary overlap. There's a lot of similarities actually in that sort of production chain. So I think one of the things that's going to be really important, and this is something that I hope in doing this work, is that we need many atlases. We need many actual sort of representations of how AI is being made from specific parts of the world and specific sectors. And certainly when it comes to China, there's so much work, and I'm thinking here of Sung Tu Hui, and I'm thinking of the extraordinary new sort of philosophies of technology that are coming out of China right now that I think are informing new ways of understanding systems. But when it comes to industrial production, if we look at sense time, if we look at ByteDance, you're looking at sort of reflections of very similar logics to, large-scale systems like Amazon. So that, to me, it's actually the curious thing is the degree to which AI economies and the political economies of AI really do reflect each other and compete with each other.
Great. My colleague, Angèle Cristal, has a question that is near and dear to my heart. She asks, Atlas of AI is a beautiful book. Agreed. Folks, if you haven't seen it yet, it is flat out beautiful. You've also done multiple art installations that have changed how we think about AI. What is the role of art in your argument?
Thank you, Angèle, and thank you for your beautiful book as well, which I think is something that everyone should be reading. Look, for me, this work is really, you could just, as academics, we could all just continue to write, just journal articles and, speak to our academic crews. Now, that's important work, and, that's certainly a part of what I do. But with things that have such wide-ranging social and political implications, it seems to me important that we find different ways to share that knowledge and what we've learned in our work more widely. And it's actually been working with artists and data visualizers that has really actually shifted the way I work and the way that I see these systems. And I want to give two specific shout outs, one to Vladan Jola, who I worked on Anatomy of AI with. We started that back in, 2016, when we met at a conference and we were trying to think about how would you show how a voice-enabled AI system worked. So we looked at the Amazon Echo, which are those little kind of beige cylinders that that you may have on your kitchen bench if you're not afraid of listening devices. And we started drawing it, and it was in drawing the sort of the data part of the system that we realized that we needed to go much deeper. And we actually need to say, well, where do these components come from? Which minds do they come from in the world, and how much people paid to work in those spaces? And soon it sort of spiraled out to be this enormous diagram and accompanying essay. And for me, that was a transformative project. And I think really one of the sort of core sort of genesis points of Atlas of AI was sort of seeing that anatomy and saying, we've looked at a sort of specific device. What happens if we zoom out and look at those practices across an entire industry? And that's, that was really why I did Atlas. So, he changed my ways of seeing in really profound ways by working together on that project. The other artist that has been such a profound influence on this book and on my work is Trevor Paglen. A project that we worked on for multiple years, digging through data sets called Excavating AI. And it really did feel like an excavation. And we spent a lot of time looking really at hundreds and hundreds of the training sets that sort of teach artificial intelligence systems to see and recognize objects in the world, specifically looking at computer vision. And one of the systems we looked at most was ImageNet. And in looking at the 14 million images in ImageNet and 20,000 categories that categorize everything from human beings through to cats, dogs, and apples. That is where a lot of this thinking around the classificatory work of systems came from. And in itself, we then turned that into an installation and an exhibition, as well as an app called ImageNet Roulette, as well as an essay. And it was thinking across those different media and those different ways of showing the work and telling the story that you can see the different sorts of communities that connect with the ideas. And I think we need that. I think we need ways of telling these stories and showing these systems much more widely so that people have a way to engage with them and that they feel empowered to have these conversations that they're so commonly locked out of, or they're told, oh no, these are very technical, complex systems you couldn't possibly understand. They're sort of mystified, in that way. That sort of mystification, I think, also leads to a sense of technical inevitability, that if something is, obviously very sophisticated, too hard to understand, of course we should use it. That part of the, enchanted determinism mood is actually one of the things that I critique in the book.
Love the vision of art as a tool for transparency and a tool for expanding that. That's terrific. Three questions have been asked by three different people, and I want to bring them together into a single kind of question. And Walter Alvarado asks, what skill sets do those who create AI tend to have in order to get the opportunities to create AI? For example, it seems you need a very high SAT math score to get a chance to enter computer science, but you don't have to have other skill sets. Are the gatekeepers creating a substantial part of the problems that you are identifying? And there are two related questions, so I'll try to get them all out at once. Todd Davies asks, how can researchers studying AI ethics be insulated from the power that we have seen will shut them down when they begin to threaten the interests of those powers? And related to that, Julia Gong asks, what can grad student researchers of AI do to advocate for and influence this kind of new thinking in our communities? Wonderful.
Each is a really rich question. So let me see how I go, and feel free to come back if I haven't answered it well for you. This first question around what skills are used to create AI, it really takes us back to that earlier beat in our conversation, Fred, where we're thinking about the way in which computer science has really thought of itself as a system that's at sort of arm's length or at a remove from the way in which those tools influence and affect people's lives. And, that comes from a long history. I mean, you could really go back to sort of the 1960s and 70s when, very, very early artificial intelligence was understood in the forms of expert systems and symbolic logic. But even then, was being done in labs, and it wasn't being live tested on billions of people. And so that sort of shift from being a very sort of theoretical discipline or an applied discipline in a small lab-based context to what we have now, which is just a mass tool of society, something that is being applied on human bodies in institutional systems at scale. that shift has happened without a big shift in what computer science is. I mean, there's been talk about, oh, we should have ethics courses, or, but I don't think that's enough. I think we're actually talking about sort of the problem of siloization in the academy as having really contributed to this way in which that deep specialization that, primarily is needed to be hired into AI-related jobs is part of the problem. That it's training us to look purely at the sort of technical system and not at these broader social, political, and ecological questions. So I do think we need to reconceptualize how we do pedagogy in a space and how we train people for these kinds of industries. But this connects to the second question, which is this idea of, how do we insulate people who are doing the work that points to some of these critical failures and problems with the social, political, and ethical questions. And here, of course, I'm sure all of us are thinking of the horrors that we've seen in relation to what happened to Timnit Gebru, who herself, was trained at Stanford, and Margaret Mitchell, and many others, that get less attention, that have found themselves not being welcome by the companies and institutions in which they work. And your question of whether we can insulate people, I think, is a really hard one, because in many ways, I don't think we can. You're looking at these kind of harsh logics around the way that companies are built and who they serve, and where the sort of profit motive sits, versus where this kind of work can be seen as being ultimately at loggerheads with that. And it shouldn't be. I mean, fundamentally, the work of people like Timnit and Margaret and many others is essential to thinking about how systems could be made differently, and how we could be focused on questions of justice and actually address issues of harm before it's too late. So, we have a big job on our hands, but I think it's going to be much harder than just a question of like introducing installation. It's really going to be at that question of what are the logics of these institutions. And for the third question, Fred, if you could just relay the third question again, because I was getting very deep in the weeds on those two.
I think you've covered a lot of it. The third question was, what can grad student researchers of AI do to advocate for and influence this new way of thinking in our community?
I mean, I think grad students are where it's at right now. I mean, if I look at the communities of extraordinary work that's coming out, and not just in the US, but around the world, including in the global South, which I think so often gets left out of these conversations. We can get very focused on, what's happening in America, what's happening in the UK. It's much bigger than that right now. And I think there's a real movement happening of extraordinary, very deep graduate research that's looking at these systems, some of which are sort of ethnographic accounts, going to the places where data labeling is happening. Some are doing historical accounts, and there are some amazing ones. I mean, of course, you have people doing this work at Stanford, including on faculty. I mean, of course, I'm thinking here of Xiaocheng Li's breakthrough work on looking at sort of the histories of IBM's continuous speech recognition lab, and her work recently with Mara Mills called Vocal Features. Strongly recommend that people read that article. This is the work that is doing the gradual shift. My hope is that we can really get that work lifted up and raised up, because we have to do a lot of change in a relatively short period of time. We're seeing this sort of huge rollout. And under COVID, unfortunately, these technical systems are being pushed ever deeper into the fabric of everyday life. I mean, we've seen it in educational institutions, sort of the increased harvesting of data as we're on these sorts of systems. And in proctoring software, we've seen it in hiring, where again, with people working from home, they're being subject to more and more tools that are surveilling them or trying to create scores of, your productivity during the day. These systems need to be resisted. They're, I think, profoundly problematic, not just in terms of how they understand work or education, but in terms of how they're going to have these much deeper impacts, I think, than the ones we're even seeing now. So that's a long answer, but it's a great question. Thanks.
It's so interesting, Kate, that the questions are tending now toward how can I resist the AIification of everything from within places that are actually building the systems. And certainly if you're a grad student at Stanford, you're pretty close to the beast. I want to pose a question here from an anonymous visitor who asks, what are your thoughts on responsible AI efforts at tech companies? How can they stay true to their mission? I assume the companies and those who promote responsible AI.
Right. Well, I mean, we spoke about this in relation to Google, but I think more broadly, we've got a real problem on our hands if people are not able to do this sort of critical work in companies, because it is going to be essential that people who are actually able to see how these systems are work can engage with them, see where they fail us, and actually share that information publicly. If what we end up seeing is this sort of bifurcation where you have academics on one side sort of studying how these systems work from the outside and kind of making educated guesses, but ultimately unable to see them. And then on the inside, you have no kind of critical publications reaching the public. Then we've got an even bigger problem than the one we have now. So certainly pushing to have, active, independent, unvetted publication cultures from within tech companies is essential at this time. Otherwise, we're going to lose the few windows we have into seeing actually how these technical systems work. And I think companies should also be under pressure, frankly, from all of us to say it is incredibly important that you support people asking hard questions and actually studying systems from the inside and being able to publish what they find. That is, I think, ultimately a democratic question as much as it is also a question of research cultures.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you on that. So Jennifer King poses a question back to China. China's presumed lack of prohibitions on access, at least by the government, to its citizens' personal data is often touted as a rationale for why US companies are at a disadvantage, with the presumption that US companies should be similarly unrestrained in their use of personal data. Would you suggest a counter-argument to this one, or another way of framing this, quote, competition?
Yes, thank you, Jen. I completely agree. And I see this same dynamic play out. And it has a history as well. I mean, if you go back to the 80s, the US was posing itself as, being in competition with Japan as, being about to sort of overtake the world with robotics and artificial intelligence then. And we're seeing it happen with China in a way that I think is fabricated and certainly amplified to suggest that there is an AI war. And what I see is precisely what you've described. There's going to be a siren going past any minute now, so I apologize for the sound. I see this sort of this idea of creating almost like a red scare around China, and that if there is this war between the AI industries of China and the US, then we could not possibly regulate in the US, because that will tie the hands of AI developers and produce, a system where essentially China can do everything and it's going to win. The problem with that is it produces a race to the bottom. It means that everybody is doing sort of the worst, most venal things they can think of and stripping data and again, exploiting labor and exploiting as many natural resources as they can to try and quote unquote win. This is a losing strategy, and we can see why. We've seen why historically, and we're seeing why now. In DC right now, this is a conversation that's happening that we must win this war. So that's something that I write about in the book. I'm concerned about the way in which we're seeing states take on the armature of technology companies, and the way that technology companies in some ways are taking on the armature of the state and doing so many of the things that we understood as sort of state functions. These dynamics are ones that I think trouble me the most. But thank you for the question.
Kate, I know that you're in conversations about how to regulate, deregulate, break up, or otherwise manage some of the large houses of AI, which is a phrase I love. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee that's on that point. Do you think tech companies and regulators should partner for regulations? Should they collaborate? Or should regulation come directly from the regulators with the help of academic institutions, perhaps? How do we manage that regulator, academe, corporation triad?
Ooh, I mean, this is a really tough one, because certainly what we don't want is technology companies writing all of the regulation, but we also need them to be actually informing regulators honestly about how their systems work so that they can be well regulated. The piece that's in between here really is how do we start to see researchers and people who've worked on these systems play a role in making policy? But also, how do we hear from the many community groups and activists and NGOs who are seeing the downsides of these technical systems, who are the ones who are, in public housing buildings, seeing what happens when facial recognition systems are installed, or the ones who are dealing with people who are going through the criminal justice system and experiencing the downsides of these systems. So I think we have many more groups that need to be part of policymaking. I don't want it to be sort of narrowed to you've got government and then you've got the tech industry and then you've got academics. We really need to sort of think about all of the groups that should be at the table having those conversations. But it's unfortunately, it is right now being seen as sort of three stools, and that's something that should change.
So we have some tactical questions here from inside firms and inside the university. Anupriya Duivedi asks, I have a question around tactical things we can do to arrive at bias-free or approaching this models of AI. Is the solution to removing bias using highly curated and clean training data? And if that's the case, how much cleaning is enough? And is cleaning data in general enough?
Thank you for the question. And it's very timely, this question, because of course, as we've seen from just last week, Facebook has released a training data set, which is created from people who gave full consent to participate and were paid to participate and to share sort of, video of themselves. So, one thing that shows us is that there certainly on the part of companies who have money to burn, that there's no excuse for creating training data sets that aren't based on consent and allowing people to actually classify themselves, which is partly what happened with that Facebook training set. But you ask, is that enough? And I hate to say it, but certainly from my perspective, it is not. Because what we don't see in the way that those things are constructed is what are the sort of the classificatory systems? How are we understanding the way that humans themselves are understood or typified in these training sets? And moreover, this shift from training sets themselves as being epistemological ground truth. Like, what is it to say that this collection of images represents people, or that this collection of images represents all of the objects in the world, which is, of course, one of the claims that are made by ImageNet and other training sets. That shift from this sort of partial sampling of the possible to say that it is representing and standing in as a proxy for the universal, that shift is one of the core problematics of AI. And as Wendy Chun was saying recently in a discussion we were having, she was saying, look, if all we can do in machine learning is train on the past, then we have a real problem. Because what we're not doing is thinking about potentiality and about flux and about the way in which the world contains infinite variety. And by doing this work of creating very narrow, very partial proxies, that in itself is narrowing and attenuating the way that we understand the world and each other.
Great. I want to just pause it. The Wendy Chun point is right on point. I want to just flag a new book coming out right on this process by Dylan Mulvin, and it's called Proxies, and it will be out later this year, just right on this point. So terrific.
I want to jump in on that and just say, as somebody who had the great privilege to see some early versions of Dylan's work in this book, it's such a much needed book, and thinking about that work of proxies. And itself also looks at sort of the earliest forms of training images, including Lena, where she has a whole chapter on that book. So yes, everyone should be reading and getting that book when it's out.
Will you remind us who Lena is, please, for folks who?
Oh, Fred, I want you to tell us the story of Lena, because I know you know the Lena story really well.
All I know is that she was a woman in a picture.
She was a woman in a Playboy picture, no less.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but yeah.
Yeah, she was, and she became this kind of core testing image for technical systems and for color balance. And, we have these histories. There are many of these testing images, and that's something that Dylan really looks at in some detail. So. Yes.
No, it's wonderful. The Lena case makes the case that the male gaze can be built, the heterosexual male gaze can be built into systems without anyone really thinking very much about it, because it was part of the social world that made the system. There's a kind of wonderful question here from Juan Montermoso that I really like, and it's I'm afraid we're going to invoke the ghost of Marshall McLuhan. I'm sorry, it's not Juan actually. It's an anonymous attendee. Sorry, Juan. The attendee asks, in the spirit of McLuhan, who of course wrote that the medium is the message, if we take AI as a rapidly emerging set of associated media, what might their messages be in the McLuhan sense? If the medium's the message, what's the message here?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, because I think about Yossi Parika's work in sort of moving sort of from the McLuhan paradigm and saying we're actually looking at the way in which the media is the planet. We're looking at the sort of geological media, the systems that are made from rocks and sand and oil that are themselves sensing the planet. That sort of shift that he makes in his work, I think, is something that's sort of really influenced my thinking here as well. That these are not just systems that are imaging the world and representing it. These are systems that are built from the actual geological layers of the earth and are in themselves in increasingly short supply, which is, again, one of the things that sort of keeps recurring for me in the fieldwork research of going to places in making the atlas, was really sort of seeing how much we rely on these mineral resources that are either extremely toxic and are in themselves leaving these legacies that will be lasting for centuries, or are also, or in addition to, are themselves kind of running out, like things like lithium crystal. As if we don't get better at recycling, we're really looking at a very short time horizon, somewhere between 2040 and 2100 in terms of the known reserves. So thinking about that part of media, not just as a thing that sort of is a message, but is actually part of the fabric of the planet on which we rest, has sort of been really core to animating this work.
Yeah, love it. I especially appreciate the comments also on energy. I'm amazed that these systems that seem so magical are in fact tremendous energy sucks. So Peggy Phelan's in the audience, and she asks for some comments on gender dynamics of AI. She notes that the ethicists tend to be women and the doers tend to be men all too often. Is that true? And how should we be thinking about gender in relation to AI?
Well, I have to say that I tend to resist the sort of gendering of responses to systems, and I certainly sort of tend to resist ones that sort of flick into these binaries of men and women, because in so many cases, we've seen critics of technology over decades from all ranges of perspectives. And so I would hate to sort of put that into sort of a centralized gender buckets. But I certainly see what you mean, that when it comes to the technical industries, they have tended to really focus on hiring men and highly sort of, masculine sort of people of a very particular orientation, from a very technical training, and from often a very sort of homogenous socioeconomic background. And what that has produced is, I think, systems that relay those logics and ways of seeing across the world. And critics, you can certainly say that so much of the sort of powerful critiques of technical systems are coming from Black scholars right now, people who I think are least well served by the systems and experience the most harm. I'm thinking of people like Ruha Benjamin, Sophia Noble, Deb Raji, so many scholars who have been pointing to these issues for a long time, but who, because they very specifically are seeing the downsides on a daily basis. So, there are many ways in which I like to be pretty careful about how we kind of think about the identities of the way that people engage with this work, but there are definitely kind of core identity types that are lionized and prioritized by industry, and it leaves out a lot of voices.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because one of the things we're doing, Kate, you do this in the book with great grace, is measuring our critique of AI against different social movements that are underway at the moment that we're studying AI. And it's a very interesting thing to think with, and the movements can become grounds for critique of AI from outside that are very powerful. My colleague Anna Gibson, a PhD student here in our communication department, has a kind of related question. She says, the more I hear, the more I wonder if data exhaust is actually the correct metaphor. Just like pollution, it seems like it goes away. But in fact, it insidiously hurts us all, especially low SES folks, socioeconomic status folks. Knowing that the two are deeply intertwined, how can we apply the knowledge from environmental justice to AI justice?
Core question. And yes, that is the big question of how do we bring not just the lessons from environmental justice, but the groups who are working on these issues right now, because we have such an urgent problem in front of us, and bring that into these debates around AI and planetary technology more generally. We could talk about this term data exhaust at length. I worry because it does tend to sort of remove the way in which it will cling to you individually, and those implications will be felt by the bodies from whom the data is extracted, as well as felt collectively. So maybe you're right. Maybe there's more to draw out. But certainly for me, you're pointing to, at this deep level, the core question of environmental justice and why it has, in so many ways, just been written out of these discussions of technology, as though, in particular, the tech sector is seen as somehow a green industry, that it's in the cloud, it's immaterial, it doesn't produce these very profound and toxic legacies. And from lakes in Mongolia through to the islands in Indonesia, where tin mining has destroyed entire landscapes and communities, I kept finding these stories which we don't tell about computation and its environmental costs. And I think we really need to start there.
You're so on point. If you ever try to buy a house in Silicon Valley, one of the things that you absolutely have to do to buy the house is get a super fund map, so that you know whether or not you're buying a house over a toxic patch of liquid.
Right. And Ingrid Burrington has done sort of amazing work, sort of starting to sort of map that. And I think too here, actually, Fred, of a book that you have that's just out in the world, which we're all excited to get a copy of, which is called Seeing Silicon Valley, where you actually do this work with, I have to say, Mary Beth Meehan. Oh, yes, you've got it there.
Yep, thank you. Yep.
The book that we all want to get our hands on, which I can't quite yet get one. But Mary Beth Meehan's sort of photography is so stunning, and it takes us into those places where you get to see workers of Silicon Valley in a much bigger way. But also those landscapes, I think, for me, they are built on toxic Superfund sites, and they do create lasting toxic legacies. So how do we show that visually? How do we give people a sense that this is not the kind of shiny, beautiful, immaterial clouds that they were promised, but it's actually going to be living and outliving us and producing legacies that we are going to be, unfortunately, having to try and deal with in the next decades?
That is a wonderful place for us to pull our horses up and turn control of the carriage back to my colleague, Lucy. Lucy, thank you very much. And Kate, thank you.
Fred, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you both, Kate and Fred. Please join me in wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in, thanking Fred and Kate for that extraordinary discussion. Again, the book Atlas of AI from Kate Crawford is out now. There's a discount code for it that's been shared in the chat. I highly recommend it. In fact, we're considering it as a course reader for our seminar at the Digital Civil Society Lab. I want to just close us out today by again thanking the good people at the McCoy Family Center on Ethics and Society for doing all the hard work of pulling this together, to the Department of Communication at Stanford, and to the Digital Civil Society Lab for hosting this event. Please check the chat for future events that are coming up. And thank you again to Kate and to Fred for both of their, for the new book, Atlas of AI from Kate, and Fred's upcoming book, Seeing Silicon Valley. Thank you all, and take good care. Take care of yourselves and your community. So long.